Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah, dear students. Welcome back to our sessions with the subject business ethics. Today's topic is one of the main and important topics here in this subject. We will talk about the utilitarianism as the first principle. So the first principle of ethics is, as you said before, utilitarianism. We have actually three main principles, but actually in order to achieve the objectives of the subject, we need to understand the foundations of these principles. And we need to understand the meaning of utilitarianism in terms of the decision maker and of course as a result for the stakeholders. So the learning outcomes for this subject is as follows. After studying this chapter, you should be able to explain the term utilitarianism as a concept, discuss the benefit analysis, cost and benefit analysis, explain efficiency in today's business, discuss the problems with utilitarianism. Actually, when we talk about the principle utility and utilitarianism, it can be understood from different point of view according to the people involved in decision, and that is why we may have some problems here. Evaluate more the major difficulty with the term utilitarianism, and evaluate the rule utilitarianism. And that we will have the following contents here, inshallah. The word utilitarianism as a concept, the cost and benefit analysis. When it comes to utilitarianism, we're addressing this to the whole society and considering business issue. For example, establishing a project, we need to understand and develop such kind of analysis. We need also to talk about efficiency, because the word efficiency actually falls in the core of the meaning of the word or the principle utilitarianism. And we will talk about the major difficulty with utilitarianism. We will also talk about the rule utilitarianism in business in general. Now, the word utilitarianism is actually one of the main issues that have been discussed thoroughly in different contexts. And in the current businesses, we have to consider decisions from different angles. Companies have to take decisions based on their own interest. However, this kind of decision might affect other stakeholders, and this can reflect either negatively or positively on the company itself. Now, we said before, in order to be able to discuss different business problems that can be ethical, but at the same time they are legal. So the point here, in order to address these issues that are actually legal but not ethical, we need first to understand the main principles of ethics. So here, that is why there's a main focus in today's business, 21st century, the demand for more ethical business processes and actions known as ethicism is increasing. More businesses in the market, more competition, more monopoly, actually were the reason why we have to discuss these issues. Simultaneously, pressure is applied on industry. Now, this pressure can come from either civil institution or sometimes government-relevant entities. So, these pressure were actually applied in these industries to improve business ethics. So, in today's business, companies may start to think about ethical issues, not because this is something they have to do, but simply because this may define the picture of these businesses in the market. So that is why we have public initiatives represented by some organizations, and sometimes we even have some laws. Example, the high UK road tax for higher emission vehicles. So because of this, companies producing these vehicles would try to come up with devices, tools, mechanism to reduce the emission of these gases. Now, based on this, we have different standards as follows: utilitarianism, rights, justice, and caring. Now, in today's business, we will be more interested in the utilitarianism principle, rights, and justice. The reason here is that utilitarianism, rights, and justice are more about running the business itself. So these things can be seen as a consequences of decisions, policies, actions, product, commodities, etc. Now, the last one, caring, is an optional principle that can be practiced by managers, especially in Muslim countries. So it is something that is somehow sounds like an alternative action, which is also considered to be an ethical issue. Now, for example, of caring is a manager who gives the employees 2 weeks off and 2 weeks on duty instead of firing these employees because of economic recession. So if the employee or if the employer, the company itself, has no options but to lay down some of the employees, like what happened in the financial crisis in 2008. So in 2008, Samsung and Sony, for example, Sony Corporation had to lay off almost 8,000 employees. Now that was actually because of economic recession. So the company was forced economically to do so. Caring in that sense is a manager trying to find any other solution but not to fire those employees. So whether or not the manager actually fires or lays those employees out of the business, this is still one of the actions that can be justified according to the economic status the company is currently facing. But when we talk about utilitarianism, rights and justice, this is something different, because what can be granted in utilitarianism may not be so regarding rights and justice. So the number of business ethical issues that we will discuss are more about these three principles, and that is why we will discuss them more in our subject. So what we mean by utilitarianism? Utilitarianism, a principle that holds an action and policies should be evaluated on the basis of benefits and cost they will impose on society. Meaning, whatever action that the company comes up with should provide the most benefit, generating maximum benefit as much as possible with the minimum cost possible. So this is utilitarianism. So the greatest net benefits or the lowest net cost. So that means the company may have different alternatives, different options. But the option that they should have to choose ethically is the one that provides the greatest net benefit or the lowest net cost. And when we talk about these issues, we're talking about the people surrounding the decision maker, not the decision maker. So we're talking about the customers, the employees, society, environment, shareholders, etc. Now, the founder of this theory is called Jeremy Bentham. Now, according to Jeremy, he believed that we need to add the quantities of benefit produced by an action or a policy, and then subtract the measured quantities of harm it may cause. That will allow us to determine which action has the most benefit or the lowest total cost among the alternatives that you have in mind. And of course, this decision should also be moral. Now, there are some implications of utilitarianism. For example, the utility Bentham had in mind was not the greatest benefit for the person taking the action. Remember, here we're not talking about the decision maker, rather we're talking about the stakeholder, the people involved. So if you're talking about a manager who takes decision, well, basically the manager will come up with a decision that serves his own interest. But the point here, the ethical point, is that to what extent this decision can also affect the other stakeholders, like customers or even the employees. So there are three considerations to follow: alternative actions, estimate the direct and indirect costs and benefits, and finally, choose the alternative that produces the greatest sum total of utility. Now that means if we want to maintain this principle in our business dealing and transactions, we have to study the alternatives that we have in mind. For example, if you're talking about producing a product, or for example, rescheduling the timetable for students. So we must have different times, different dates. So we try to choose the date, for example, Monday, Tuesday, that fits both the lecturer and the students. So this is why we must have at the very least 3 alternatives, and that these alternatives should also be studied in terms of the direct and indirect costs and benefits. So for example, if the exam was set on Monday, do students have another exam on the same day? Do they have another exam on the day before or the day after? Is that exam quite difficult? The students wouldn't be able to deal with the 2 exams. So these are examples of costs that students may have. On the other hand, the benefits here of having the exam this week, so students won't have to study further or extra chapters, for example. And finally, we choose among the alternative, the one that produces the greatest sum total of utility. Now, utilitarianism is also the basis of the techniques of economic cost-benefit analysis. Now, what does that mean? Utilitarianism is actually based on providing the greatest benefit to the society with the minimum cost possible. So when we talk about projects, as we talk about the project, especially those projects that can be for the public interest, so we have to consider the current, the present benefit, and also the future benefit. Doing so, we also need to consider the present cost and the future cost. So out of which we come up with this term, cost-benefit analysis. For example, this type of analysis is used to determine the desirability of investing in project. So by analyzing the present and future benefits together with the cost, we can tell whether this project is ethically good or is of ethical potential, or potentially important for the customer, the public, in the long run. For example, dam, factory, or even public parks. So here, what we mean by cost-benefit analysis is that the project's present and future economic benefits should outweigh the project present and future economic cost. In other words, we do not only think about the present benefit and cost, we should also think about future benefits and cost. So that is a point here. Now, another term, as we discuss utilitarianism, which is quite relevant to this ethical principle, is efficiency. In efficiency here, companies try to operate in such a way that one produces the most one can with resources at hand, which means that in order to be efficient, companies should think about resources used. They should use technology that reduce cost, the use of materials, recycling materials, etc. So now this efficiency is actually maintaining the interest of the whole society. And not only society, the current society is gaining benefit from efficiency, we may also address future generation. Now, what problems do we have here? When we talk about utilitarianism, there can be 5 major problems with utilitarian reliance on measurement, which means that sometimes it can be really very difficult to measure whether an action is of great utility. That is, in terms of measurement. What sounds good for some people may not sound so for others, as follows here. Comparative measures of the values are really very difficult to measure, and that people can also be different in measuring the value of different things. For example, how much you value the time, the place, the product of a certain features, etc. Some benefits and costs are impossible to measure. For example, the life of people, safety, privacy. So these are issues that you cannot really measure, and accordingly you cannot discuss or you cannot come up with a consensus agreement as to the meaning and the value. Benefits cannot always be reliably predicted, so they cannot always be adequately measurable. And besides, benefits from one person to another cannot be exactly the same in terms of prediction. So some people may consider benefits in the long run, in the short run, while others may consider values and benefits in the long run. So these discrepancy and differences may cause problem in defining utilitarianism. It is also unclear exactly what counts as a benefit or cost. So if you're talking about people considering or who are a lot more interested in arts, for example, the time and the effort they spent in drawing a paint is not considered to be a cost as long as they maintain their own interest. So the point here, people can be different in terms of interest, and accordingly, measuring what could be a benefit or cost can also be very intriguing and very difficult. Finally, not everything has a monetary equivalent. As you said before, your life cannot be measured in terms of money. However, we have counter arguments here. When measurements are difficult or impossible to obtain, then we may use other ways to do so. For example, the common sense judgments or the comparative value can be different tools. Now, what we mean by common sense here, there are two widely used common sense criteria. For example, the one that relies on distinction between intrinsic goods and instrumental goods. So intrinsic is something that is inner or are things that are desired for their own sake. For example, the health and life. While instrumental, there are things that are good because they help to bring about an intrinsic good. So the other common sense criterion depends on the distinction between needs and wants. Now that is something that we can see in the market. So what is considered to be wants may or needs can be considered as wants in other markets. Even the use of technologies, products, tools, machineries, appliances can vary from one place to another. Goods that bring about needs are more important than those that bring about wants. So if you want to talk about utility, so we may need to talk more about needs, which means that it can be wrong to discuss the best alternative if you're talking about wants. But it can be good to discuss the best alternative if you're talking about the needs. So this kind of differences can help us come up with the right decision. Now there's a major difficulty with the principle utilitarianism, and this is about the other kind of terms, which is utilitarianism is unable to deal with the two kinds of moral issues, that is, rights and justice. How is that possible? Utilitarianism only looks at how much utility is given to the society, but it fails to take into account how this utility is distributed among the member society. That is why utilitarianism works like an umbrella under which benefits is given to the whole society, but it does not address how much of this utility should be given to every individual in the society. Now, the last issue here is about the rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism has two parts. One, an action is right from an ethical point of view if and only if the action would be required by those moral rules that are correct. So if we have different alternatives and that we choose among those alternatives, then what is chosen should also be based on moral rules that are correct. A moral rule is correct if and only if the sum total of utilities produced, if everyone were to follow the rule, is greater than the sum utilities produced if everyone were to follow some alternative rule. So it means that we choose among the best alternatives, and that the best alternative should also be morally correct. So according to the rule utilitarian, the fact that a certain action would maximize utility on one particular occasion does not show that it is right from an ethical point of view. Why is that so? Because sometimes companies may think about different alternatives and they can claim that they choose the best alternative that provides the greatest benefits with the minimum cost possible. But in fact, this decision is not ethical. And that is why the rule utilitarianism considers two issues: greatest benefits and cost, and at the same time morality. So this action does not provide, for example, or does not cause a monopoly, does not cause harm to one of the stakeholders in the market, even competitors. Now, dear students, we come to the end of this session. We come to the conclusion where we have discussed different issues regarding today's topic, that is utilitarianism. So we learned what utilitarianism actually means as an ethical principle. We discussed the cost-benefit analysis, especially when we talk about projects. We discussed the meaning of efficiency in today's business. We also discussed different problem and major problems affiliating with the terms utilitarianism. We evaluated the measure of difficulty with utilitarianism in light to other kind of principles like rights and justice, and we ended up with the principle or the term rule utilitarianism. You have an assignment attached to the session where you have also to address the main principles here, and you can also talk about your point of view regarding how decisions should be applied in companies. Also, these questions actually measure the students' comprehension in terms of ethical background regarding the company's decisions. So students' answer may vary in terms of the content, in terms of the justification. So by this we come to the end of today's subject. Thank you very much for listening. See you inshallah next week. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.